One of the most confusing things to figure out when downloading a new FPS aim trainer or game is always the settings. What should my sensitivity be? How do I optimize performance? What settings are extra and unneeded? If you're like me, I always want to make sure that when I play, I'm able to focus on the game and improve quickly. What is going on, ProGuides family? It is your host, Sergeant Frost, and today I'm going to talk about how to optimize AimLab for aim training for Valorant. We'll cover some topics like graphic settings, sensitivity, and crosshairs, with the main focus on how to make it as clean as possible. So with that said, don't forget to download AimLab and like and subscribe, and let's get started. So first things first. One thing that everyone has to do if they actually want to practice well is to have the right sensitivity in AimLab. Because different games usually run different engines, people need to use a sensitivity converter to find the same sensitivity between games, and then also factor in other things like FOV and whatnot. Luckily for us, AimLab has built-in settings to match most games. So all you have to do is go to settings and then go to control tab and then change the game profile to Valorant. After that, just put in the sensitivity you normally use in Valorant and it will be a 1-to-1 match. And the FOV will automatically be adjusted to Valorant's default FOV, which is 103. After that, there's not much really to worry about with the sensitivity. AimLab makes it easy, so there's not much to really have to research or anything. Even with stretch resolutions, Valorant normalizes sensitivity so it's always the same. But if you want to play other games with stretch resolutions, you may want to mess with the vertical sensitivity options a little bit. Covering most of the easy stuff first, the next thing you should do is mess around with the crosshair settings. This is pretty self-explanatory, so I'm not going to talk much about it. It functions pretty similarly to Valorant, so if you're trying to make the same crosshair you have in game, it shouldn't be hard at all. But one thing I do want to say is that depending on how you set up your background and targets, you might want to change your crosshair to have better visibility. And I guess before we head to the visual settings, I want to show you two clips. One without optimizing your settings and the other with optimizations. I think you'll notice a very clear difference, and depending on whether you think the optimized version feels cleaner or better suited for your training, you'll get an idea of whether you want to make these changes. So anyways, let's take a look at the default version. As you can see, it's not very clean and there's a lot of stuff going on. It's kind of hard to keep track of everything and it feels too cluttered to really focus. Now let's take a look at a more optimized version after changing settings. Clearly, this is a lot more streamlined and in some ways, it looks like you're not even playing the same game. But what the optimized version allows you to do is to focus more on the training, while also allowing you to have better visibility, and also maybe give you a couple more FPS while you're at it. These are the settings that pros like Tens and other people who aim train a lot use to get rid of the clutter, and I think that these could help your gameplay too. So if this optimized version looks good to you, then let's get into the settings. On the topic of backgrounds and targets, the default background is fine, but at times it also feels quite distracting. In the visual settings, you can change the background to be a solid color or other textures as well as you mess around with the colors in general. Personally, I wouldn't recommend any of the weirder backgrounds like angels, industrial, and crazy fur in the textures. But I guess if you're trying to practice aiming with low visibility, it could help. In general, I would suggest changing color mode to single color, and then texture to solid color and messing with the color of the background to fit your liking. Some people like black or white, but in general, making it a solid color is meant to make the background feel more consistent and less of a factor. The next thing to cover is to have the targets that don't blend into the background color as well. If you end up with targets that have the same color as the background, you're just going to be squinting to tell the difference. To change target colors, go to the game settings and just head to the target color settings. You can choose from a few preset colors, or you can make a custom one by messing with the RGB sliders. The A slider is very important because that stands for alpha, which is a measure of the transparency. I don't think there's really a reason to go under 255 since it's the most solid color, but if you know something that I don't, feel free to let me know. If you noticed on the right that there are 3 circles with a 2 that says hit and miss, these are actually the colors used for tracking scenarios. You can change them by changing the respective color settings underneath the sliders. So when you're on the target, the color is whatever you set to hit the target, and when you're not on the target, it'll be the miss color. Pretty self-explanatory. At the same time, you should change the countdown time to whatever number you feel is a comfortable amount of time before the scenario starts to prepare. Personally, I find 5 seconds to be a tad too long, so I set it at 3 seconds instead, especially since I tend to restart sometimes if I start off a scenario really badly. Finally, one of the most important things to change in the game settings tab is the weapon visibility. If I'm being perfectly honest, the weapon is always going to be a distraction, and unfortunately, the weapons in AimLab don't quite look like the weapons in Valorant. So even if you want to practice with the weapon being on screen, it will just look weird and distracting. I heavily recommend hiding the weapon visibility so that you can have a clean screen when playing and therefore letting you focus more on the scenario at hand. After all, the main goal is to train your aim to improve in Valorant. Although we're not covering specific training tips in this video, I think it's worth mentioning that AimLab is one of the best ways to improve your aim, and it's completely free. Not only will you find training playlists made by pro players, AimLab has even partnered up with Valorant to create some cool challenges made to help us gamers always give us our best shot. So if you haven't already, make sure to click the link in the description to get started today. I think it goes without saying, but the color settings I just covered are pretty important to consider with each other. The crosshair needs to not blend into the background or the targets, and the same applies to the targets with the background. So if you set your crosshair as blue, it's a good idea to have a different color for the targets like yellow, and then have the background be a color that doesn't blend with the blue or yellow. Now that we've covered most of the color settings, now we want to optimize interactions with targets by removing the visual effects that show up when shooting at a target or missing. To do this, go into the graphics settings in the graphics tab and basically turn everything off. You don't need to really worry about them, but if you're interested, here's what each thing does. Post-processing effects is just improved visual effects for all the other effects that I'm going to list out. This basically just makes the effects look better, but since we're turning off most of them, it's not really that relevant. However, if you do want to have certain visual effects on, this could be left on for those. Muzzle flash effects is pretty self-explanatory. It's just the flash that shows from your weapon when you shoot. In reality, you never want this anyways. It can really mess with your eyes if you're playing a scenario like grid shot because it flashes like 200 times. Showcasing visual effects is like bullets coming out of your gun, which is pretty pointless and also just distracting. Bullet impacts effects is when you shoot and miss. The bullet will create a mark on the background. This can be useful for spraying in Valorant to better control the recoil. But in Aim Lab, when you're just trying to train your aim, it's not really useful since you're especially not spraying your gun or anything. Player damage effects applies to things like playing Spider Shot, where if you miss the target and it resets to the center, the screen turns red to indicate that you missed. Also, in some scenarios, you might get shot at by custom targets. For most scenarios, this isn't relevant, so it's really up to you whether you want that for some specific scenario, I guess. Target destruction effects is the shattering effect that shows up when you shoot at a target. This one is really distracting at times, but it's also pretty cool. If you like to see the targets shatter away instead of disappearing when you shoot them, then it's fine to leave them on. Apart from the graphics settings, the only other important thing to do is to turn the max queued frames to 1, which gives you the lowest latency. The rest of the settings are all personal preference and setup specific, but try to keep them the same as your Valorant settings. And now that we've covered pretty much all of the visual related settings, it's time to cover some audio settings. In aim trainers like Aim Lab, there's actually a whole lot of customization with the hit sounds. You can basically upload any file you want to play on when you hit a target, but I just use default metal 1 or 2. What's important is to find a sound that doesn't feel too loud or annoying to listen to, since you're definitely going to shoot a ton. So if you want, you could totally upload a sound of your favorite sheriff skin and train in style. But other than that, I think turning off the kill and spawn sounds is good because there'd just be too much audio clutter if you have them all on at once. That's my opinion, however. Some people like to have the kill sounds on to confirm a hit. And with that being said, if you followed along and made the changes I just covered, your Aim Lab should feel completely different but also much cleaner as well. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It's been Sergeant Frost, and I will see you all again in the next video.